The one thing we all know about the theory of evolution is that it was proposed by Charles Darwin about 150 years ago. Well, not quite. The idea that organisms evolve was floating around for 2,000 years before Darwin and was revived a bit before his time by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. But it didn't gain much ground because there was no obvious mechanism by which one type of animal could change into another. Lamarck suggested that maybe animals changed because they felt the need to change. It didn't sound very scientific, and with no evidence to support it, the idea didn't go very far. What Darwin did was to show a plausible mechanism by which these changes could happen. And let's not forget poor old Alfred Wallace, who came up with the same idea and published it jointly. The paper they wrote was this. Darwin had come up with what he called the principle of natural selection. These days, we tend to call this the theory of evolution as a kind of shorthand, but that's confusing, because we also use the term theory of evolution to describe the fact that organisms evolve. I want to leave the physical evidence and the proof of evolution for the next video. In this video, I just want to look at the mechanism, to see whether, sitting in our armchairs and not doing a bit of research, we can predict evolution in animals purely on the basis of what we know, that animals replicate themselves, and that the replication isn't perfect. There's always variation. Just taking these two known facts and nothing else, what do we expect might happen if we keep copying a hypothetical animal generation after generation in a changing environment? Let's say the Hypothecus lives in a tropical climate, grazing happily on grass and plants. We know from our two principles that not every Hypothecus is the same. This one has been born with a slightly longer neck. This one has slightly longer legs, the third has slightly longer claws, and the fourth has a slightly hairier body. Over time, herds of Hypothecus spread across the continent. But the climate changes and the continent dries up. Only scrubby bushes and hardy tubers can survive. The Hypothecus with the slightly longer neck can obviously get to more leaves than its neighbors. Inevitably, taller and longer-necked Hypothetica are better fed and fitter, and therefore reproduce more. A few generations later, the drought has caused overall numbers to dwindle, but there are more long-necked animals. But natural selection doesn't suddenly stop just because average neck length has increased. The longest of the long necks now has an advantage over ordinary long necks, and so the process continues. We've seen how it can grow taller over time in order to survive a change of climate. But there may be other ways of surviving. This Hypothecus, for example, may not be able to compete well for leaves, but because of its longer claws it can dig more easily for tubers, so it would have a better chance of survival and its genes would be passed on. The question is not whether the Hypothecus would change over time, but what could possibly stop these changes from happening. Each generational change may be tiny, but millions of years of accumulated change in a changing environment leads to two completely different animals. The question is whether their DNA would by then be so different that they could no longer breed.